Welcome, good evening. What I wanted to play was Hillel's Ozi v'Zimratiyah, because like I always try to pick a song that's thematic, but that song actually has the word part of some of the words that we're gonna study tonight. And some of you know it, right? We can sing it together. It's like Ozi v'Zimratiyah. You can all sing with me. Anyway, so suffice it to say, some of the words that we're going to study tonight are classics, recorded in song, car classics even. And yet, I was a little nervous to teach them because what we're going to look at tonight is the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam. And we got to look at it. I mean, we got to. And I've been actually showing it to you, I think, every time that we've met. I'll do it once more for a third time. It's like it's the classic poem in at least the Torah, if not the whole Tanakh, and I'll soon say why. But it's also certainly like famous. I've shown this to you a number of times just because the brickwork nature of its scribal layout here. So it's like it is as think E.E. Cummings here, it's as much a visual poem as it is a poem of words. And by the way, what is the visual? Why is it laid out like this? Anyone know what's going on here? I see people speaking it out. Yeah, El?
The sea's on both sides and the Yehudim are crossing in the middle.
That's right. It's a real visual poem, right? But there are the Israelites crossing through the two sides of the sea. So
which ship? What are you in? What were you looking at? Which section? I didn't hear.
Oh, the Song of the Sea. It's chapter 15 of the book of Exodus. This is the poem. I mean, this is the moment where, remember in our first class, if you were with us, we sort of like picked out a couple of lines from the first chapter of Genesis and said, oh, that's a poem. That seems like a poem. And the second chapter, first. That's a poem, but this is a poem. I mean, this is like, it's obvious, it's visual. By the way, keep yourselves on mute when you're not talking, just because we can all hear the background noise. It's not just visually stunning, but it also is the very kind of paradigm of Shirah, of a poem. And that is because it very distinctly and specifically says, then Moses sang a song, or then Moses recited a poem, right? Like, and that word, as we've been saying all along, it's both in Hebrew, so we have to keep that in mind. A song and a poem, same word, Shirah. But it's very explicit, and it happens in a grand declaration, and it is becomes a kind of a reference point for thinking about singing or poetry. It all goes back to the Song at the Sea. So surely we have to study the Song at the Sea. Not only that, but it's a classic. Like when we read it in shul, it's Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of the song, and we actually recite it in our morning prayers every morning. It's a classic, right? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is just what's in it. The problem is that when we actually stop and look at the words, I gotta say I felt like a little uneasy because they are not pleasant. Now, we did some not pleasant last time, and you know that there's some not pleasant in the Hebrew Bible. That's why it has its fiery reputation, Old Testament God. But this isn't God talking. This is Moses and the Israelites talking, and what they're saying, I don't know, as we'll soon see, I'm not sure that we are going to feel so comfortable with it. At least I'm not sure I feel so comfortable with it, because it is triumphant poetry. It's triumphant poetry, but with the real fervor of triumph and the kind of gloating of triumph that starts to feel a little bit much, starts to feel a little lacking in basic human compassion. Okay, I'm already speaking out too much. I'm already saying too much, but I just wanted to tell you kind of what we're in for. We're headed to the classic poem, and yet one that isn't isn't something I would pick for like my favorite messages that the Torah has to offer. So prepare yourself. Okay, let's just let me make one announcement actually, and then we'll say a blessing, and then we'll enter into our learning. The one announcement is that I want to start giving a heads up for 2 weeks from now. There is a Thanksgiving tikkun that we always run at Ikar. And usually it's a really fun, festive gathering where we're like having a good time with each other and also doing good for the world by collecting items for needy families to have food on Thanksgiving. This time it's just a drop-off, a food drop-off at our offices and at the Silver Lake JCC. And then we'll do, like we usually do learning afterwards. So there's some online learning. Rabbi Tzadok and I are going to be teaching classes. And that's 2 Sundays from now, not this Sunday, but the next Sunday. It's our Thanksgiving tikkun. So that's just one announcement I promised I'd make, and I would forget at the end. Okay, let's say a blessing. We'll say a blessing, just sort of consecrate this space. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. To immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Okay. Okay. So I kind of like I spent all this time kind of just trying to speak out my discomfort, or maybe to anticipate your discomfort. So angsty, right? Like starting so angsty. But I just want to say it's not just my problem, and it's not just my perception of what your problem will be. This is a problem that Chazal had. This is a problem that our sages had. Okay, so lest we think this is just like a modern discomfort conversation. No, this goes all the way back. The rabbis of the Talmud, confronted with this, this epic poem that is the poem of the Torah, the rabbis of the Talmud themselves expressed discomfort. And let's start by seeing how they did that. Okay, so here's a source sheet for you to look at tonight, and you'll need just a few verses to understand where the rabbis are coming from, and they are in chapter 14 of the book of Exodus. This is sort of where our story starts. Okay, so suddenly, like, they're fleeing Egypt, right? They're fleeing Egypt, and then Pharaoh's changes his mind and like had let them go, and then decides to start pursuing them, and so now the Egyptians are following after them, and then like the drama really starts to build here in verse 19, because the angel of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. It's like amazing. Think about the sort of like the choreography or the mapping of this here. The angel of God is out ahead and then goes and moves behind them, and the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took a place behind them. There's these two sort of forces, mysterious forces, the angel of God and the pillar of cloud, and it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel, right? So it blocks it. There was the cloud with the dark. There was a cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other all through the night. Okay, little mysterious, like mysterious what's happening there at all, but there's the rabbis are going to play on that last phrase. So the one could not come close to the other all night. Now let's just do the pshat. Who can't come close to who? Right? It's not so hard to figure out who can't come close to who all night. Someone just unmute yourself and just say it.
The Israeli or the Egyptian army from the Israelites.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. It seems like of all the mysterious things happening, this one seems pretty straightforward. The angel of God in the cloud blocked the Egyptians so they couldn't get to the Israelites. But it is a little bit vague. The phrasing is a little ambiguous, right? The one could not come near the other all night. Lo karav ze el ze kol halayla. Now, I want to say that's not, we know what that means. So that is to say that when we see the rabbis saying, well, what did that mean? You can tell that they're building a case. They're making a space to insert their thoughts, but that's where they start from. And this is the piece from the Talmud that I want to use to echo some of my own discomfort. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said in Rabbi Yonatan's name, what is meant by the one could not come near the other all night, right? Well, we know what that means, but they're saying, we don't know what it means. So what exactly does that mean? And the answer is, in that hour, the angels wanted to recite Shirah, a song or a poem, before the Holy Blessed One, but God rebuked them, saying, the works of my hands are drowning in the sea, and you would utter song before me? No, no, no. Okay, so what is God? Someone speak out God's position here. What is God saying? What's God? God seems upset. What's God upset about?
God's saying something terrible is about to happen. We're about to lose lives, and you're about to sing a song of triumph.
Yeah, exactly. This is a scene of death. The Egyptians are about to drown in the water. That's the whole thing, right? Like, we headed into the water. We'll soon read the actual story, but most of us are familiar that the idea is that we charged into the water, the sea splits. Oh my gosh, what a miracle. And we go in and then we get to the other side. The Egyptians following after us. The miracle wasn't just that the sea parted for us, it's that it then collapsed on the Egyptians. It's like it's a real, it isn't just a battle, it's like total devastation. And I think that the interpretation we just heard is right. God is saying, whoa, you were saved, but these are human beings. I created these people. It's just like, don't get too happy about it. You're gonna sing a song, you're gonna recite a poem. Okay? So I want that sort of that tension hovering over our conversation tonight. God's tension. Or the rabbi's tension, right? But really, what are the rabbis angsty about? What are they angsty about? Because in the Talmud, it sounds like they're angsty about the angels who were singing this song before God, and God rebuked the angels. Bad angels, right? But what's the real problem? The real problem is that we're about to sing a song, right? This is like one of the Talmud's methods for sort of sending out a kind of a discomfort in kind of coded language. Oh, the angels, boy, they shouldn't be singing right now. Meanwhile, Moses is about to sing, okay? So, and when I say sing, this is a biblical poetry class, and you might imagine that Moses is about to recite a poem, a major poem, a poem of triumph. And as the rabbis read it, they're a little bit wigged out by it. What do you mean? There are people dying here. Is this a time to sing a poem? Okay. All right. So that's all by way of kind of wind up. Let's take a look now at the story. But before we do, any thoughts or comments so far? Gary, I saw you had a hand up.
Well, I'll wait. Go ahead.
Okay, Yonatan?
I do want to say, it seems you're presenting this this passage from Sanhedrin in a particular light, because there is the next statement, which is not here on the study sheet, where Rabbi Yossi says, okay, so God doesn't rejoice when wicked people die, but God does make the good people rejoice when the wicked people die.
Oh my gosh, no fair for you to like click in and see the rest of the Talmud. I'm supposed to be the holder of all the information. No, but you're exactly right. In the Talmud, there's actually it's part of a larger discussion. Does God rejoice when the wicked die? And that discussion is right to the point. The rabbis actually can't figure out whether that makes sense to them. Maybe God's on our side. And when our enemies lose, God's like, yeah, down with the Egyptians. I mean, it's Pharaoh after all. Like, was God, just to make the obvious and overused, like, was God happy when Hitler died? Does that even make sense? Or would God have said, I created Hitler. That's a person, right? And so the rabbis are indeed troubled. They go back and forth. Let's take a comment from Kate, and then we'll move into our text. Or Kate or Matt.
The song
Can't
of the
hear you, can't hear
sea.
you. It's choppy.
You know? Or-
No, it's not coming through clearly to me. Anyone
How
else?
about- hear us now?
No, I'm afraid not.
No?
No.
Okay,
No.
never mind.
I'm
Never
sure it's
mind.
brilliant, but for now we can't hear it. Okay, let's do this class. We're going to do some poetry analysis, and I've sort of promised you that we're not gonna talk around poetry. We're gonna do poetry. We're gonna but this class, more than some of the others, we do need a little bit of the lead in and the backdrop. Part of what I want to do tonight is understand the place of this poem in our collective national consciousness, and why it is celebrated and claimed, and also why, as you just heard, there's some discomfort around it. Okay, but in order to understand the Song of the Sea, we have to know what happened at the sea. And a lot of us remember the basic storyline, and a lot of us have seen the Ten Commandments, right? So we, whether Disney version or Charlton Heston. So we have images in our mind. But let's read the story, because it's just some of the most majestic writing in the Torah, but we also need this information, okay? So this is now the continuation here of what we just read, right? The angel of God, and it couldn't come through. And then in verse 21, we pick up, and now the action really begins. And at the end of this, the poem will begin. And I'm going to ask you at the end of this, what just happened here that prompted a poem or a song? Okay, so I'm gonna be prepared. I'm gonna be asking that question. Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Eternal One drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians came in pursuit after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. At the morning watch, the Eternal One looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian army into panic. God locked the wheels of their chariots so that they moved forward with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Eternal is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Eternal said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their horsemen." Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But the Eternal One hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Pharaoh's entire army that followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. They all died. But the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, and the waters forming a wall for them on the right and on their left. Thus the Eternal delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Eternal had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Eternal. They had faith in the Eternal and in God's servant Moses. That's the story. That's the end of chapter 14. And then, and the next word is then. So it's really like this happened, and then, and this is like a famous moment, Az Yashir Moshe Uvanei Yisrael. And then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Eternal. And they said, and here's the beginning of it, but you can just see the language here. Az Yashir, then Moses and the children of Israel sang, Et Hashira Hazot, this song or poem, Ladonai Vayamru Lemor, they sang it to God and they said, and that, so far that's not poem, right? We've seen this before. There's like a little bit of a declaration before the poem begins. And here's the poem begins, Ashira Ladonai ki ga'o ga'a. I will recite a poem. I will sing a song. So everything that I've said about the centrality of this poem and the sort of paradigmatic nature of this poem, it also begins with the word, I will now recite a poem. Here I go. I will sing to the Lord, who has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver, God has hurled into the sea. Okay. You already have a taste of what's coming, right? Like, God's so great, and God destroys everything. But before we start looking at the poem itself, the question I said I was going to ask, what just happened? And I just want us to think about the way human beings respond, write, compose poetry, sing. What just happened that specifically and paradigmatically made Moses and the Israelites burst forth with poetry, with song? Okay? All right, see some hands up. Liz.
The piece that I think happened that we haven't talked about yet is that God is the one that hardened Pharaoh's heart in the first place. So God delivered, but God delivered against something that God did. For me, there's a tension there that they're saved, but they're saved from something that, had Pharaoh just let them go in the first place, wouldn't have been as momentous, as highly charged. So
Okay. So one way that we might answer is to say, this is the ultimate demonstration of something that has been true all along, which is that God is in charge of all of this. And what they see is that, like, there's been no battle, there's been no strategy. God just has controlled every single thing. And that's what wow, God's in charge. Now God is in charge of the water, right? God is in charge of everything. Okay, so that's where that thought leads. Dina.
Well, it's also, not only did God save them from the Egyptians, but they just witnessed the total destruction of their enemies by God's hand. And that was the miracle, because they were running for their lives. They were frightened, but God stood between them and the Egyptians, and they witnessed the total destruction of that army.
Good. An unusually totalizing victory. That's what I expected. Maybe we would fight. We may expect we would lose. I might win, but that's it. The war's over like that. This needs a song. Gary?
I think a lot of this is about human nature. I want to go back to just right before when you were talking about what was going on there. I think what also was going on there is we see a human dilemma. You see your enemies killed, you see something terrible has happened to them, and your natural human reaction is to celebrate, but then there is a God, which means there's a value system, and you've got to stop and you've got to think rather than move with the natural human reaction. And I think the same thing just happened here. The sea has split. It's the ultimate journey, the ultimate Jungian journey, when they talk about the journey and something happens that turns your life around. They've walked through this water parting. They have gone literally from one side is slavery and now the other side is liberation. And there's a whole new land in front of them. There's a whole new life in front of them. There's nothing to pull them back here. And they're about to celebrate the unknown that's better than what the known was. Okay,
good. I want to underscore both of the things that Gary was just saying, because I think both of them are helpful framing thoughts for our conversation. The one is just the idea that this is the moment. This is it. They crossed over, and that's significant. Something that we're meant to associate their burst of song with this. This is the defining moment. This is when they become a people. This is when they are liberated. This is it. There's actually a threshold, right? There's actually a crossing through. And that, you're right, all kinds of images. You mentioned the Jungian, like what other images can we, birth itself, right? They are born out into the world through this passageway. So yeah, it is a moment of ultimate glory. It is the defining moment. And yet, and this is, I think, very important, the way Gary framed it is very, very helpful. on the one hand, and Gary says something actually rather provocative, but I want you to consider it, that it's actually natural when all your enemies die to be like, yes, hooray, we will sing at the death of our enemies. That's natural, that's human. That is, maybe the answer is the most straightforward answer. Yes, when your enemies die, you are happy and you sing to the Lord. But the Lord means values, ethics. You're in a, like, doesn't that represent some standard that would actually maybe temper that very instinct, right? So there's a conflict here between what may be a very natural human reaction and the larger system here, which, the rabbis of the Talmud put into the mouth of God, saying, whoa, like, I helped you, but we have values here. We have principles here. Okay, take a couple more comments, and then I want to get into the actual poem. Emil?
I was going to say, like, it says it in the verse, like, it uses the word fear. And, like, I think we also sing when we're afraid, right? Like, you get, like what Gary said, for sure, like, peak emotional moment, like, yields, like, song. But, you could also read it as, like, what the hell do we do now? Like, it's terrifying. Everyone is dead. We're in the middle of the ocean. And it seems like when you have, like, people are learning, guitar and stuff to get through this tough period. It's like when you're not sure, when you're afraid, you sing. Maybe that's part of it as well.
Good. Thank you for that, Emil. That's a very keen eye there that notices that the people were afraid. They feared God. So, like, they're going to be throughout this poem, they're going to be celebrating God, but they were actually afraid of God. And, the word is awe, but, like, it's also fear. And then the very next thing that they do is that they had faith. They had faith in God. Fear and faith, right? So there's a confusing, like, mix of sensations and emotions. God is amazing. I believe in God and I'm terrified of God. And all of that swirling around is part of what produces this emotional release. We've spoken already about how poetry can be a way of saying something that a rational mind can't find, just like, oh, I sing to the Lord, right? Okay, one more comment and then we'll see this poem. Alexandra?
Something I find really fascinating is thinking about, like, tracking the Israelites' understanding of God and how that changed and how that grew. And I think that coming from just being slaves in this slave mentality, that it makes sense that for them to sing differently would be like impossible in terms of their mentality, but that perhaps this is one example of why they needed to wander in the desert for 40 years to change. And this is an example of the mentality that needed to change before going into Israel, possibly.
Okay, good. Okay, that's a great segue, because that's another way of asking this question. Is this a moment where Moses and the children of Israel composed the most glorious poem, epic poem that our tradition has ever known? Or is this a moment where they still got to learn what it means to really write a nice poem? Because this is a little, like, there's something. Okay, so you judge for yourselves. Let's get into it. Let's start looking at the poem. We're not going to look at all of it because of our limited time, but you'll see themes that are glorious and admirable here, and then you'll also see why discomfort is hovering over this conversation. Okay, so let's begin, and right, this is where Az Yashir Moshe Uvanei Yisrael Et Hashir Azot Ladonai Vayomru Lemor. Right, that little lead in, and we often lead in that way, and then the poem begins Ashira Ladonai Higao Ga'a. I will sing unto the Eternal, who has triumphed gloriously. Sus v'rochvo Rama vayam. Horse and driver, God has hurled into the sea. Okay, as we do sometimes, let's just take that first line, this is the first verse, and just use it as a way of trying to recognize what themes. It is true in biblical poetry that the first line often sets the themes for us. And So I want to ask you, what are the themes you see here? The one translation thing that is totally lost here is the words ga'o ga'a, which is like it's like a Hebrew idiom, a way of repeating a verb to give it emphasis. And the word there, ga'a, or geut, is like what we might translate as pride or glory, pride, right? Ani ge'a baze, I'm proud of that. So it's a little like, it's almost like I'll sing to the Lord who is prided with pride, right? That might be a more accurate translation, but that's a little weird. So I will sing unto the Eternal who is prided with pride, who has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver God has hurled into the sea. Okay, so what are the themes of this poem so far? Let's name them.
Praise.
Praise, good. We praise God. Good, what else?
I would add to that translation a physical aspect of it, that geut also refers to the rising of water.
Ooh, I did not know that. Is that right?
Yeah, in modern Hebrew, geut is high tide.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh,
There's
great.
a hardcore pun going on here.
Yeah,
Ooh,
that's
I
in the
love that.
that's in the Robert Alter translation as well. Robert Alter says, for he surged, surged, horse and rider, he hurled into the sea.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I've never known that. That's so great. That's great. Okay, good. Okay, good. So the poetic device is really deep here. Thank you, Anne and Jonathan. Okay, other themes. We have that we praise God and that God is glorious. And what's the other major theme that we have here?
Triumph.
Triumph. More than that?
Destruction of the enemy.
Good. Destruction. Destruction of the enemy. God has took the horse and driver and threw it into the sea. And the praise is really great, and that's going to continue to be a theme, but the destruction is also going to be there. So, let's track both of these themes as they continue to thread through this poem. All right, let's continue. Ashir Ladonai ki ga'o ga'a, sus v'rochvo rama vayam, and then comes Ozi v'zimrat ya, vayhili lishua. The Eternal is my strength and might. God is become my deliverance. Now, I invite you, keen Hebrew readers, to parse this as well, because I've never known exactly how to. The words here are my strength, and it looks like, and the song of God have been for me a deliverance. But it seems to be that these refer to God. God is my strength. And so then we've translated Zimra as like the might, the cutting might of God. But it's a little bit funny because it's joined to the word for God here. I don't know exactly how to translate that. I invite Jonathan, Anne, or others like with their keen eyes to help out. But the classic translation is, God is my strength and my might. God has become for me a deliverance or a salvation. Ze Eli v'anvehu. This is my God, and I will enshrine God. The God, Elohei avi v'aromamenu. The God of my father, and I will exalt God. Okay? So those are the famous lines. So they seem like, yay for God, yay for God. But let's just try to dig into these lines that have become so celebrated as to still be sung regularly at Ikar. What is God in these lines? What are some of the things that God is? I'll put them back on for a second. The Eternal is my strength and might. God has become my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine God. The God of my father, and I will exalt God. What is God?
Invincible.
Invincible.
God
Good.
of Israel, the God of the Jews.
Ours. Nice.
The God of the Jews.
Yeah. What else?
He's a warrior God.
Okay, we're about to see that. I wanted to hold off on that. Because so far it's like, oh, God's my strength. But you're right, Florine. It's already, there's a power in this description. But it's a power that, nobody minds saying God is my strength. Nothing wrong with God being strong. And nothing troubling about those metaphors, because you need strength to provide salvation and deliverance, right? Okay, but Florine takes us into the next line, which is really where things get tricky in all kinds of ways. Not right, not least of which is anthropomorphic, and not least of which is gender. And there's so many things. This next line is Adonai ish milchama. Adonai shmo. God is a man of war. Eternal is his name, right? I always translate Adonai as eternal because it has a little bit of that connotation. So Adonai is his name, right? The Lord is his name. But okay, we really, really need to stop here, as Florine stopped us, and take a look at this line. God is a man of war. God is his name. So I'm bothered by that. I'm bothered by that for all kinds of reasons. But like, how is God a man? First of all, it's just such a what a weird metaphor. God is a man of war. What are we meant to understand there? Am I just out of step with the biblical value system? And what a great description of God. I see some people nodding yes. That's a fair answer. But let's I don't know. Let's see. God is a man of war. God is the eternal is his name. Yonatan, what do you think?
So in spite of your invitation, I don't want to get too far into the puns of the text. But when it comes to God as a man of war, let's remember the Torah is not saying that God is a man of war. The Torah is saying that Moses said this, right? And that the people said this. They could be wrong, right? We're getting a window into the way that these people perceived God, which may be a fallible perception.
I love that. I will resist my usual urge to repeat what you just said, because you just said it perfectly. I'll just leave. That's right. Kate and Matt. Unmute first.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, great. I'm just intrigued that he's a man, but he was a cloud and he was a fire, that we've been given a whole bunch of different, very real physical.
Mm-hmm.
That, well, yeah, it's a man and that's a little disturbing to us. He's so many different things. He physically, and yet eventually becomes this non-physical up in the sky. So that just, I don't have anything to do with it. I'm not giving it as an answer. It's a I don't understand. Or I'm
but you don't understand, but it's well put, because this is on its face obviously a metaphor, right? This is because God is described in so many other ways in the very passage. This is meant to be a metaphor, but what's the metaphor? What's the idea that God is a man of war? What are we saying about God there? God's powerful. God likes war. God fights well.
God as the infinite. God as the infinite, can manifest himself and withdraw himself from that infinite being into an act as if it's a man of war. So he can compress his infinite aspect, and operate like this in a worldly way to conquer an enemy.
Okay, wonderful. By the way, last comment, I think comes not just from Australia, but comes from Thursday, right? Jack, are you not? Jack is Emil's father visiting us from Australia. I think it's tomorrow where you are. Is that right?
Yeah. Carol's been trying to say something for quite a while.
I'll turn to her next. I just love the idea that we're learning now with people who are in Thursday. It's okay, but beautiful what you just said, Jack, which is that, yeah, that's the idea, is that God, what they experienced, and as Yonatan put it, this is their experience. What they experienced is God came down, God, the infinite, somehow manifested as, I'm right here with you, I'm fighting your battles with you. Here I am, let's go, right? And that's part of the experience, is this mysterious force is now one of our soldiers or our general. Carol, go ahead.
I want to go back a little bit, because I think what's happening, one of the things that is happening here, is that the power and the might of God is now being transferred into the people. If you go back a couple of verses from talking about God outside, if you go back, it says, the eternal is my strength. God has become my deliverance. This is my God. So the Godhead, as it were, or whatever it is, has now entered into the people.
Okay, I love that. I love that. And I love that, broadly speaking, as a sort of a manifest, like, what is war poetry? What is triumphant poetry, right? And I think the way that you're framing it, Carol, is like, in a religious context, perhaps triumphant poetry is taking our own battles and attributing them to God. Now, like, what we have done is godly, because after all, as you said earlier, Carol, God is on our side, right? God of the Jews, right? Now, I must say though, even as I follow Carol into a kind of like metaphorical abstraction here, in this case, there's a literal truth, like God actually did the thing, but it is, I think Carol is suggesting also just a metaphor for maybe the very splitting of the sea is a metaphor for the way that when we are truly victorious, it is as if God has come and fought our battles for us. Maybe that's the point, is that when you survive, you feel that God is with you, God is on your side, and that's part of what
it was mystical. The whole thing was mystical.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna take a couple more comments and then we'll push forward. Rachel?
I mean, I just think it's human nature to claim that God is on the side of any war and all fighting, and it's kind of been, and I think it's human nature, because if God wasn't on your side, then what? You're just a murderer for all the wrong reasons.
Right, I mean, that's the piece in the Talmud, right? It's like, wait, these are still people here. So if it wasn't justified, right?
You have to, I think, like, you have to feel better about the actions that you do sometimes. I mean, you have to sleep at night, but I also think it's like, I feel like I'm always the person comparing Judaism to Hinduism, but in like the Upanishads, when the gods are coming down to fight wars, and to me, it is always more of an argument towards the non-dualist of, well, if we're creating the image of the divine and the divine is in everything, then of course God would then be with the people and a god of war and a god of songs. So those are the two. I feel like there's a practical element to just anytime you're in a battle, and also just like if you're in a relationship with the divine and they're in the sea, you're moving the sea, then God would be with you.
Okay, I love this. I love the way that Rachel is like, Carol suggested that the poem is a kind of attribution of what just happened to the divine. Oh my gosh, there's been a triumph. It is as if God has manifested. What Rachel is saying is something similar, but almost that the poem acts as a justification for what has happened. Like, there is something deeply troubling about it, but you can imagine Moses and the Israelites saying, no, this is good. It's God's work. Don't worry. Even though there are dead people all around us, it's okay. God has done this, right? There's something like that going on there as well. Estra.
Weaving in some of the prior comments, I think of Carol and Yonatan, and maybe some of what Rachel has said, but maybe from a more base or historical angle or base kind of human response again. I'm thinking, like, what would be the audience that the Israelites are singing this to? And I can't help but have this image of like Paro somewhere on the other end, and thinking that all the times when Paro was like, tell your God this and tell your God that. And always saying like, yeah, well, I'm not buying all of what's going on here, plague after plague. But this is the final crowning moment, right? I mean, and so at this point, perhaps another angle of this Song of the Sea is to Paro saying, this is my God now. Do you get it now? Like, do you get it? Now we've won the last battle. And also the anthropomorphizing. Like, again, I never thought of God's nostrils until I came across the song through Handel's Israel and Egypt. I was like, what? That's Torah? God's nostrils? But anyhow, but perhaps, you know, they're putting it in words that maybe, as Yonatan said, made sense to them, maybe doesn't make sense in the grand scheme, but also in a language that maybe Paro would understand, you know, kind of like, we told you so, and do you finally get it?
Okay, great. That's so helpful, Esther, to take us back a little bit, because it is easy to look at these words and get a little bit like miffed that they are not compassionate enough. And the Talmud seems to be concerned with that as well. But look, let's put it in the context of the story. These are people who have just endured 400 years of slavery, right? This is like This is a guy who has tortured people, killed babies. So yeah, we're happy. And I don't feel any discomfort about that at all if I'm a slave fleeing from Egypt, right?
Dancing
So
in the streets.
What's that?
Dancing in the street.
Dancing in the streets. Okay. Okay. So Esra mentioned some of the imagery here. Let's just see. We're running out of time, so I'm going to read a little forward into the poem just so we get some of that imagery. It's quite just as poetic movement. It's quite beautiful. You can also think though how well does this capture what just happened? What kind of rendering is this of what we just saw? But here comes the poet actually now telling the story. So Pharaoh's chariots and his army God has cast into the sea, and the finest of his officers were drowned in the sea of reeds. Markavot paro v'chelo yara vayam umivchar shalishav tuvu v'yamsuf. Tahomot yechasyumu yardu v'imsolov kamo aven. The deeps covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Yamin chadonai nedari bakoach. Yamin chadonai tiratz oyev. Your right hand, Eternal One, glorious in power. Your right hand, Eternal One, shatters the enemy. Uverov gaoncha taros kamecha. In your great triumph, and there's that same word, the gaon, right? The geut, which can also mean the rising. That's new for me. In your great triumph, you break your opponents. You send forth your fury. It consumes them like straw. Tishalach haroncha yochelmu kakash. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. Over ruach hapecha nermu mayim. The nitzvu kmo ned noslim. The flood stood straight like a wall. Kafu tomot belev yam. The depths froze in the heart of the sea. Really great stuff. I mean, really great, poetically, really great stuff. But what do you think? Does this capture well what happened? What is there any spin here? How do you read this narration? Anybody notice anything that they want to point out just as we got taken poetically through what we just read in prose?
Well,
yeah.
One thing that's jumping out at me and that I've always felt, one thing that's jumping out at me right now is the elation that they have because they had been pursued in a very violent and terrifying way by Pharaoh and his chariots and they weren't armed at all. So they might have had a little package of weed on their back, but they weren't armed. And this whole army's coming after them. And then they're faced with the sea. And then they have to jump in with, they have to take the first step in before it opens up. They must have been absolutely terrified. And so they probably are so relieved and grateful that they must have been weeping while they say this.
Yeah.
That we had no chance of surviving this, and God swooped in and saved us.
Great, thank you, Yael. I mean, it's funny, we are almost at the end of our hour, and it's funny that we haven't said this yet. It was a miracle. It was, I said it's the paradigmatic poem. It's the paradigmatic miracle. The splitting of the sea was the greatest thing that God ever did. Right? That's the ultimate, when we talk about miracles, that's the one we talk about. And, so the people just witnessed a miracle, meaning there was no way they could win. And so, yes, you see that God actually did this. And in the story, God did it. God opened the sea, right? Matt.
There we go. One thing that gets me is that we have, the description is very simple. The water came down, they drowned. That's the description. This is so many layers of forceful, physical, direct action. It is so completely different than the description we had before. And I have no idea what that means.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's right. We got the action, but now it's like they sank like a stone God blew them out like straw. There's a real kind of in-depth of what every sort of, and look at them sinking, and look at it going, like really kind of working through what was all of a sudden like this kind of cataclysmic event. And now it's like, no, and then this happened, and this, and God was working in this way, and God was working in this way. Okay, you know, we're near the end of our time.
Just real fast, it's almost like some kids are saying, well, did you see that? Did you see it? He did this, and then he did that, and then he got him this way, and then he got him that way. So
yeah. Okay, we're almost. I muted myself instead. We're almost at the end of our time, and I really want to show you one kind of like last twist. So I'm going to skip the rest of the poem. I'll read through it quickly because there are some other good lines in there, but we're not going to analyze the rest. I want you to see something that happens right after the poem because I think it's pretty important to notice because it sets a pattern in motion. So where were we? Oh, this line I think is really important. I wish we had more time because then this is the one line that actually gives me, I'm a little unnerved by the poem, and then suddenly I feel sympathy because look, the poem says, Amar oyev erdof asig achalek shalal timlaeu nafshi arik harbi torshiemo yadi. The foe, the enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will bear my sword. My hand shall subdue them. Right? So we heard their perception of what God is like. This is the perception of their enemy. Coming at you, pursuing you, taking everything, satisfying their desire with you. But neshafta beruchacha kisamo yam taluka foret b'mayim adirim. You made your wind blow, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the majestic waters. And then here's another famous line from the Song of the Sea. Mi chamocha ve'lim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh. Right? Who is like you, eternal one among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness? Nora tehilot osefel, awesome in praises, working wonders. Okay, there's a lot to be analyzed there. And I'm sorry I try to keep this to an hour because I just feel like online learning is good at an hour. But I rushed us through it so that we could see what happens immediately after the poem. Because the poem is recited and Moses recited, we didn't get through even what I gave you, and what I gave you is half of the Song of the Sea. There's much more. But then at the end of it, something interesting, sort of unusual happens, which is that at the end, the very next thing we read is that then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her in dance with timbrels, and Miriam chanted for them, or answered for them, Shir l'Adonai, ki go ga'a, sus v'rachvo rama v'yam, sing unto the Eternal, who has ga'o ga'a, who has prided, who has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver God has hurled into the sea. And that's it, meaning we don't get the repetition of the entire Song of the Sea, but Miriam, after Moses is done, goes out with the women. They've got these timbrels, and they recite the first verse there. What do you think is happening? How do you read that?
Yes, exactly. It's a song. It's to be repeated again and again and again. You create a poem for children to learn, a song for children to learn from generation to generation. And I think that's partly what this poem is, that it's, you learn poetry. You don't learn prose the same way as you learn poetry, and you repeat it. And it's to be repeated. And Miriam, there she goes with the women, and she repeats the headline, as it were, that they would always remember.
Okay, Carol, you've done so much great work tonight. I thank you so heartily. and you're really taking us home as well. So I want to use Carol's comments now to because I think Carol's really onto something. I want to use those comments to show you something that happens in the tradition, and we'll sort of end on that, and I'll stay after if we want to keep discussing for another 10 minutes. But Carol suggests that Miriam, what the commentators wonder, did she recite the whole poem, or what happened there? But Carol's interpretation is that Miriam heard the poem and then started saying, all right, Shir l'Adonai ki go ga'a, sus v'rachvo rama v'yam. There's a kind of, and the language there, it could be translated as chanted, but it's also answered. She answered. So there's a kind of, suddenly Miriam picks up on it and is like, okay, let's make a dance out of this. let's make a song out of this. And it's just the first line, right? She just takes the first line. Now, I think that's a beautiful interpretation. There's something powerful about that, because what Carol's also suggesting is that's kind of what happens. Someone sings a song, someone else sings back. Someone recites a poem, someone picks up on a phrasing. And then it begins to course through history. And there's a remarkable thing that happens that I want to close by showing you, which is this poem actually does keep coursing through the Hebrew Bible, but not the part that Miriam recited. Imagine that Miriam's like, why don't we just take one verse and we'll recite it again and again? But she picked the first verse. And the first verse is cool. It has the part about, Yonatan's pun about the waters rising, but it ends with God took them and hurled them into the sea. That's not really my favorite line. What's my favorite line? Oziva Zimrat Yava, right? That's my favorite line. But let's take a look, because that's a famous, we sing it. There it is in the Song of the Sea. But look at this. Some of you may know this, but it keeps popping up again and again throughout the history of Hebrew text. So in the book of Isaiah, and we say this in Havdalah, Hine El Yeshuati, here, behold the God of my salvation, Eftach v'lo efchad, I will trust and I will not fear, right? Similar sort of themes. Ki, because Ozi v'zimrat yavai, right? Because God is my strength and my might, and God has been my deliverance. It's Isaiah quoting Moses. And look, this happens yet again in the Psalms. Oziva Zimratia by Hili Lishua, right? That very line, and this is unusual, is repeated 3 times, or repeated twice, appears 3 times in that exact phrasing throughout the Torah. So it isn't just Ikar, it isn't just the Jewish world that's picked up on that second line and said, this is the one we want. This is the one we like. You can see it happening in the Bible itself. Exactly as Carol is imagining. Isaiah's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, but I love that line. Let's sing that line. And then we get to the point we're at now, where we sing happily, but we don't sing the part about the Egyptians dying, because we're not the slaves who just left, and we don't need to relish in their destruction. And it isn't, right? We can boil it down to a few beautiful ideas like Mi chamocha ve'elim Adonai, or Oziva Zimrat Yavai li Lishua. So beautifully put, Carol, and I hope that's a little insight into the way this poem continues to filter throughout Jewish history, going all the way back to the prophet Isaiah. Okay, that's where we'll stop. But let's I'll say we'll take final thoughts and comments and concerns. Let's see, anyone who has not spoken yet. Michal, unmute yourself.
Sorry. One of the things that I think is interesting about the Song of the Sea is that the phrase "man of war," we came upon it and we're like, that sounds strange to us, but the truth is we're not troubled by calling God a king, right? Melech Malchei Amlachim, and that's actually also a god of war. A man of war. That the king is the man of war, and in the ancient world, the kings and the gods are all talked about in the same way, and they're talked about the way they are talked about in this poem. So there's a lot of sort of mirroring going on in terms of sort of the language and the imagery, and it all sort of fits together with the idea of not just battle and godhead, but also kingship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Right. There's a catalog of metaphors that seem particular to these people and their world, right? And I think you said very, very incisively, a king is a man of war, right? So let's think about that metaphor when we use it. Emil.
Just a question, like, is it spontaneous composition that, like, the children of Israel all come up with this song at the same time? Like, is there any commentary that addresses, you know, if someone was leading it, or if it was just like, you know, like a group chant that sort of emerged?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't there's no obvious answer to it, but I like the question as a kind of an answer itself, because that's what it feels like. I think that we're meant to read it as if this just sort of burst up out of them, right? Now it seems so composed, but you know, theologically you would say, well, that's the prophetic voice, like they can just sort of start speaking in poetry. But you're right, it feels a little too orchestrated to be a spontaneous poem, and yet it's placed in the narrative as if then then all of a sudden he sang, right? Great. Anyone else not speak? Okay, we'll take two last comments. Rachel?
So I owe quite a bit of this to Carol and Yael. I'm not good at pronouncing Hebrew, as we all know. So when I was thinking, when we start with the commentary at the beginning, well, God is saying to the angels, don't sing this song, but then, you know, the Israelites do it. What I get from that is like the bigger picture of when you can step back, but then at the time they're very traumatized. I mean, they have been held in slavery. They had to go into the water, not knowing if they would live, and they're going to feel that way. But in the bigger picture, God's not going to rejoice because God wasn't in servitude. And then we in 5781 can take a step back and say, oh, this is kind of violent language. But the human thing is to rejoice in that moment and to be free of the trauma and to, not be that upset that your enemy has drowned. And I think it's such a beautiful way of showing the bigger lesson and the human reaction that we have in the moment. They aren't necessarily opposed to feel viscerally, and then to be able to study and have the results of thousands of years of commentary. Because we now, at Passover, we don't, after we dip our finger in the wine and we don't lick it, it's because we don't celebrate that other people suffered. So we're doing that now at the same exact time, both kind of things being held together, and then with the words reverberating throughout the Torah, and you don't go back to the violent imagery anymore. It's this was the song they sang in the moment, but the lessons carry out through on, and the further we get away from the trauma, we see the bigger picture in where the rejoice is in survival and faith and stepping into the ocean instead of living in servitude.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That's very insightful. And I must say in response that I was, as I said at the outset, a little bit hesitant about this poem. I wanted to teach it. It's such a classic, but I was never could. It didn't seem like it would be so inspiring. What do we do? And then I thought, honestly, as I was preparing this, maybe this is a good moment in our social national lives to reflect on triumphant poetry, right? Maybe this past week, where there has been, in some ways continues to be, but seems like mostly over, a great battle in the country. There's a lot of people using triumphant language, right? And a lot of people who feel yes, the enemy is gone, and I don't mean just the one Pharaoh. I mean the whole other side, they're all rotten, and maybe it is worth thinking in this moment, what part of our response right now is just a trauma response? What part of our rejoicing and our celebration is actually just the venting, the purging of just suffering and hatred and anger and frustration, right? And maybe not all of that is good. Maybe, or at least maybe it's human, but maybe not all of it should be recorded and preserved. And maybe we wouldn't want to be remembered by everything we're saying right now. Maybe there's one line, maybe there's one insight, maybe there's one thought that we have that will continue with us, for the one thing that we will hold from this moment that will be noble and glorious and true, but maybe it's covered in a lot of trauma language as well. So I think it's worth thinking about that. And I think it's worth thinking about, and the rabbis are asking us to think about in any moment of triumph. You know, like, don't be so quick to celebrate the defeat of your enemies, who are your enemies, surely, but are also human beings, right? And, you know, in the end, our very participation in this tradition means that we recognize the divinity of all human beings, right? Even those who oppress us, even those who are drowning in the sea, and thank God after all these years. It's like, let's be cautious about that. And maybe in this moment we're there, but in the course of history, let's see what survives, what message we'll still be holding on to when we have the wherewithal to reflect and to look back. All right, I think we'll end there. Thanks everybody tonight for taking this journey with me.
Thank you, Rabbi Kasher. What a great
Next week.
class.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Shalom, everyone.
And then Shabbat and everything else. All right, bye everyone.